Having recently co-authored this history of Aboriginal literature for Cambridge, it's like Cambridge History of Literature, Canadian literature. I've been thinking a lot about where we've come from and where we are. As you know, Aboriginal literature starts with the oral tradition. And the oral tradition has been around since time immemorial. And what we might call contemporary literature, in one way started, I would say, with life writing. So after the oral tradition, there was documentation of the lives of Aboriginal people, which was usually done by non-Aboriginal people. We've seen a change now, and I would say particularly with the establishment of Aboriginal publishers. We had Pemmican out in Manitoba. We have Thetis Books out in the Okanagan. There's Kaganats. I think they're mostly poetry, but yeah, they're out in Ontario. Anyway, so once Aboriginal publishing became established, you had more and more opportunities for Aboriginal peoples to tell their own stories. This occurred late 60s. There's historical reasons for that into the 70s, and it continued. From life writing, the other big genre was poetry, and there's reasons for that as well. In poetry, as Louise pointed out, I Am Indian featured people like Duke Redbird, who was one of the first Aboriginal poets to be published widely. There were others as well. But his name comes to mind. And that book came out late 60s, so it's not that long ago. And why poetry? Because people who were writing poetry had other jobs, they had lives, they didn't have the luxury to sit down and write a novel or sit down and even write a story. There were certainly oral stories being translated, but usually those were being translated not necessarily from people in the communities, or at least people in the communities were doing it at times, but they weren't getting the credit. Usually it was academics would come in and take the credit, take the publishing credit. It would be like Nanabush Stories by Joe Blow. What? So those kind of things were going on. Later on, with Aboriginal publishing, you had more and more Aboriginal people having agency, taking some measure of control. From poetry, then you had people starting to write short stories. And then, as today, we have all genres. We have novelists, we have people who made professional careers. For the longest time, Aboriginal people weren't even considered writers. They were considered storytellers. We were told, no, you write stories, you write traditional stories, you're not professional authors. But now we have everything going on today. There's again reasons for that. These institutions they're a prime example. People started getting degrees, going to college, seeing, as Louise pointed out, other examples. For previous generations, there were no other examples. There were just very few texts out there actually authored by Native people, so you never really had a role model. You only had these non-Native author texts. So that's changed now. We see ourselves in print. Younger people can actually take Aboriginal literature courses. This has all happened since 1990. There weren't even Aboriginal courses. I think Carleton had one of the first, and I think it was only established in the early 90s. I teach at Carleton now. I'm doing those courses. So that's not very long ago. So that means you would go to a university and study Shakespeare. You would study Brit Lit, you would study American Lit, you'd get Canadian Lit, but Native authors weren't even in the mix. Maria Campbell, her half-breed, which came out in 1972, was being taught in social work courses. It was being taught in sociology courses, whatever. It was not being taught in literature courses. Aboriginal literature didn't exist in the mainstream, in the eyes of the mainstream. So talk about marginalization. If you were writing Aboriginal literature, where were you publishing? Because people were writing. We had Pauline Johnson at the turn of the last century. Of course, you had all that residential school stuff, but there was still people writing. Where they were publishing is in their own Aboriginal newspapers. You'd go to the newspapers, you wanted to see Aboriginal poetry, you wanted to see some stories, we were publishing ourselves. So that was one of the kind of good things that came about with Trudeau's multiculturalism policy, because Trudeau said, well, we're going to let all the ethnic groups in Canada publish their own newspapers and everybody will live happily ever after. But what he didn't realize is that Native peoples, we would start publishing our newspapers too, through the Native organizations, through the Friendship Center. There was the Native Perspective magazine, which was published through the National Friendship Center. There was Kainai News, there was all kinds, Ontario Indian, there was Tawau, there was tons of people really wanted to speak out. So we saw this opportunity, and there was just a flood. If you go back now and think of all those news, some of you are too young, but for those of you who are a little older, if you think of all those Native newspapers that were coming out in a very short period of time, you know, we did that ourselves. We said, hey, let's just start publishing. So if you look at them, yes, there's lots of political writing. It's about, you know, band issues and housing issues, but there was always creative writing in those newspapers. So that kind of led to where we are today. That's the forefront of that movement.